Hello, I'm Thera Barber. I'm a member of First Presbyterian Church. Um, I've been thinking about how over the years Christian biographies have just impacted my life so much. Um, I read about these men and women who've been used by God and have read about how He has sustained, provided, worked through them, done amazing things. And when I read them, I think I don't want to miss out on whatever it is God has for me. And during times that I'm struggling, I'll pick up a Christian biography and it just motivates me to keep going. And I was just thinking that right now we're in troubling times, more so than I can ever remember in my lifetime. And I thought it might just be encouraging to hear some contemporary God stories, and I have some that I've had over my lifetime, and I thought that I would just share with you one of those today, and maybe one more in another week. Maybe some of you know I was living in London in the 70s and the 80s. I was working with Crew, but the last 7 years I was in London, I was leading a women's Bible study geared for large groups of women. We had over 100 women involved, and we were meeting in central London in a beautiful church. If you've ever been to London, you know it's dusty, dirty, noisy, crowded. You just are constantly running into people and being slowed down by traffic. And the place where we met was St. Paul's, Portman Square, just a haven. The women loved coming to this church. It was just quiet and beautiful. A lot of royal blues and golds in the church. And it was just a place where we had a wonderful study, and the women loved coming. Well, we met there for 4 years. The study was called Community Bible Study. At the end of 4 years, John Stott, some of you know that name, commandeered our church. He wanted to do a school of evangelism, and he wanted to use our church for it. And so he decided to take over church, which meant our study had to find another church, which is not easy to do in London. It needed to be an evangelical church. It needed to be the size so that you could accommodate a number of groups. And there just were not that many churches to be found. And I had been searching for several months, couldn't find it, and it was coming to a crunch point. Every year, Community Bible Study had their teaching directors come to the United States for a week of training and inspiration and encouragement and so forth. And this particular year we were going to be meeting it in Colorado. Just before I left, somebody said to me, "Have you tried Westminster Chapel?" Now that's not Westminster Abbey. It's the chapel, which is a few blocks down from Westminster Abbey, very near Buckingham Palace. It's an old historical church. If you know the name G. Campbell Morgan or Martin Lloyd-Jones, it was their church. A fellow by the name of R.T. Kendall was the current pastor. I didn't really know that. I'd never visited the church. I didn't know that much about the facility. I certainly didn't know R.T. Kendall. I thought, well, when I get back, maybe I'll see if that's a possibility. So I go into the conference in Colorado, and up in the beautiful mountains. It was in March, so still a lot of snow around. And one morning I was sitting before breakfast having my devotional time, looking out on just the majesty and the grandeur of that place, thinking, Lord, if you can do all this, I know you've got a spot for us. I just haven't a clue where. If it's Westminster Chapel, I'm certainly open, but I just need your guidance and direction. Well, after my devotional time, I went in to breakfast and sat down next to a fellow who was writing the commentary for our material for the next year. His name was Dr. Sam Schultz. He was an Old Testament professor from Wheaton. And we got to talking, and when he found out that I was living in London, he said, "Oh, my son lives in London." He said, "I'm going to go visit him next week. And I'm going to visit a very dear friend of mine as well, R.T. Kendall, the pastor of Westminster Chapel." Don't you love the way God just delights you with immediate answers to prayer? So, of course, I couldn't have had somebody better to pave the way for me. Not only was he a good friend of RT, but here he was totally involved in community Bible study. So he paved the way for us to meet in this church. Well, we were there for a year, and as it happened, it was not really that conducive for our class. It was old, dirty, dingy. It was very difficult for the women to get to, hardly any parking. We had a children's program, so the women were having to figure out ways to come and bring their children. And so, you wonder, at the next year we found a more conducive place, but you wonder, Lord, why did you have us move there in the first place? Well, after I moved back to the States, a few years later, I found out that Community Bible Study had invited R.T. Kendall to come on the board of the organization. Because Community Bible Study came from the States, it was an American study, which meant in the British mind it was a little suspect. We did have a few American classes scattered around, or a few English classes scattered around. But because R.T. Kendall came on the board and was well known in the British Isles, he gave credibility to our study and encouraged British people to consider doing this particular study. Today, there are over 100 classes in the British Isles. So it's a reminder that God provides, maybe only temporarily, but when he does provide, he has long-range purposes for whatever that provision is. So that's just one little story. I have a P.S. story for another time. That move affected me personally, so I'll share with you about it as well.